The Unpaid Ledger, Season 2, Episode 12, What Comes Through. Chapter 1. Sterling Underwriting had a clock on the wall that ran 3 minutes fast. I'd noticed it the first time I sat in that conference room, hadn't mentioned it, and hadn't stopped noticing it. Today it read 3:58, which meant 3:55, which meant I was on time. Leland was already there, and she was always already there. I'd had 4 hours of sleep, and Mortimer hadn't dropped below warm since the cemetery the night before. The coffee from the gas station 2 blocks from Sterling was doing the work the sleep hadn't. Good enough for an afternoon meeting. Maybe not good enough for what came after, but that wasn't something I could solve right now. The table had more paper on it than the last 2 meetings combined. 3 months of sensor logs, anchor load data, frequency signatures plotted in columns tight enough that I'd need better eyes or more sleep to follow them. Leland had her pen in hand, the folder open, the look of someone who'd been in the room for an hour and was ready to work. Marcus was on the speaker in the center of the table. He'd called in from wherever Marcus was at 4 in the afternoon, which was probably the back of the shop with the chipped teapot and the cold window. He'd said young man when I sat down and hadn't said anything since. He was waiting for the two of us to assemble what we had before he offered anything. I put down what I'd found at Elmwood, my side of what had been pulling on me. We went through it together. She walked me through the exterior data section by section. I mapped my side against each section. The process was slow and took concentration. At the end of the first pass, we had something neither of us had been able to see with only one half of the data. Leland walked me through it twice more from 2 different angles. The picture stayed the same. The anchor wasn't improvised. It had one attachment point, and every case I'd worked since the river had made it stronger. I hadn't known it was there. Marcus said from the speaker, "The gray space doesn't do that." Neither of us said anything. "It follows what it finds," he said. "It doesn't build to specification." For it to have built this precisely, it would have needed to know Eddie Lusk already. He was in front of your gray space before the river, before you tore the opening. I said, "Someone got there first." "Someone knew your gray space existed before you did," Marcus said. "And they introduced it to Eddie. So when you tore the opening at the river and he came through, it recognized him." Leland had the pen in her hand and wasn't writing. She was looking at the table. I asked Marcus why someone would do that. "That is the next question, young man. The people who can answer it have spent 40 years being hard to find." Leland uncapped the pen and wrote something in the margin of the top page. She capped it again. Whatever she wrote, she kept to herself. I looked at the sensor logs in front of me. Every case I'd run laid out in load distributions and frequency signatures. Every cost I'd cleared had made the anchor stronger. I'd been maintaining someone else's structure the whole time without knowing I was doing it, the same way you maintain a habit you can't remember forming. The who and the why of who had put him in front of my gray space was tomorrow's question. Tonight had a different schedule. Leland said, "The mapping event itself will generate a signal. Combining the interior and exterior data, the anchor's never been seen from both sides simultaneously. It'll register the attention." She was already pulling her laptop closer. "We should move." I was putting on my coat when Mortimer went loud. Not from a pull, not from anything I'd done. The anchor had been seen from both sides simultaneously for the first time, interior and exterior combined in the same room by the 2 people who each had half of it. Whatever the anchor's structure did with that recognition, it registered. The bracelet didn't cause the event, it reported it. The signal went out from my wrist in every direction before I could do anything about it. Leland was looking at her laptop before I'd finished understanding what had happened. Every sensor in her network had spiked at the same moment. I looked at the bracelet. Mortimer was running hotter than I'd ever felt it run from something I hadn't started. "How long?" I said. She looked at the readings. Hours. Could be less, young man, Marcus said from the speaker. It found you. Drive. I left. Chapter 2. I parked 3 blocks from the cemetery. Street parking near the gate was gone. 3 blocks on foot. February in the dark, doing the job the season required. I had my hands in my coat pockets, keeping them still, trying to keep Moromir at whatever temperature it was at without doing anything to push it higher. I made it 1 block. The hit came from the left, around the front of a parked SUV. And it had no direction, and every direction at once. The streetlight halfway down the block cut out a half second before it landed. Not hands, not a body force. The way a wave carries force, directional and heavy and not interested in what was in the way. It took me off my feet and drove me into the side of the SUV hard enough to rock the vehicle on its suspension and set off a car alarm 1 row over. My left shoulder hit the door mirror on the way in. The mirror was not the winner. I was on the asphalt on the driver's side of the SUV. And I got up because getting up was the only option that led somewhere other than the asphalt. Moromir was already running hot. The hunter's force had gone into the bracelet the same way a snapback went into it. And Moromir had taken all of it without asking my opinion. My right forearm was burning from the wrist toward the elbow. I had blood from somewhere on my face. Where it was coming from wasn't clear and wasn't the priority. I took 3 steps toward the cemetery gate. The temperature in the air dropped a noticeable degree about a second before the next hit landed, lower this time, and both knees went down on the asphalt. I got a hand on the SUV's hood and pushed back up. Between that car and the next, there was a 20-foot gap where I had nothing to push off of. I covered it in the open, and the hunter used the gap. The hit caught me in the back and sent me into the side of a station wagon 2 cars ahead, face first into the rear quarter panel. I got my arms up before my head arrived, and my forearms took most of it, with the station wagon getting the rest. I got my bearings off the station wagon. The blood from my face had made it to my chin. I felt the cold of it where the skin was wet. My right forearm, where Moromir sat, had gone from burning to a deep, even heat, the bracelet running at its upper range and holding steady, converting everything the hunter had put into it into stored weight. I'd never had it this loaded outside of active work. I calculated the distance to the gate. 1 more block, 1 right turn. I got moving. The cemetery gate was down the block and a right turn. I could see the stone pillars at the far corner. The hunter pressed again from the left, and I was already moving right, so the force sent me in the right direction and I went with it. Using the momentum the way I'd learned to use the sink, not fighting what was available, just directing it. I caught the driver's door handle of a sedan for a half second to change the angle, and then I was around the corner. The gate was 30 feet away. The last hit caught me at the corner, full force, from directly behind. The kind of impact that doesn't leave you time to manage it. I went into a chain-link fence that bordered a vacant lot on the cemetery's north edge. The fence held. The fence did not care about me personally, but it kept me from going through it, and I pulled myself off the chain link and looked at the gate. I ran the last 30 feet. My left shoulder hurt. My right side hurt worse. I ran anyway. The gate was stone and wrought iron, and it was open, and I went through it. Chapter 3. The cost density inside the cemetery hit me the way it always did. Old weight, 140 years of costs absorbed and settled and held. Deep enough now that the ground had stopped giving them up. The sink didn't push against anything, it pulled toward it. Moromir shifted in response, away from running hot on impact and toward drawing from what was around it. The way it drew from the environment when I worked. The burning in my right forearm eased a fraction. I stopped at the first row of stones and put my hand on one and let Moromir draw for a few seconds. The bracelet warmed in a different way, pulling in instead of taking hits. I needed everything the cemetery would give me before the hunter made it through the gate. I knew these stones, markers from the early part of the last century, names mostly worn off. I'd sat in front of them twice before for the anchor work. Tonight I made it to them because my legs had a limit and I'd found it. The hunter came through the gate. I knew it had because of the leaves. The cemetery had patches of dry oak leaves left over from autumn that hadn't moved all winter. And now a section of them at the gate lifted in a sudden updraft that had no wind to explain it. 6 feet behind the leaves, dust rose off the gravel path in a column that should not have existed in February. The hunter wasn't visible, but the disturbance it dragged behind it was. Inside the cemetery, it couldn't land the way it had on the street. The density interfered with the targeting, diffused the angles maybe, or the ground absorbed part of the force before it arrived. Whatever the cause, the hits inside were heavy and sloppy. The hunter could still press, could still move me, just couldn't hit from 30 feet with the same accuracy it had managed between the cars. The first press inside drove me against the fieldstone marker with enough force that my vision went white and came back. I didn't go down. Mortimer absorbed what it could from the hit and kept drawing from the ground and ran hotter from both inputs combined. A second column of dust rose 10 feet to my right, where the hunter had moved to find a new line. Through the tether, the pocket compressing. Eddie on the other end of the bracelet, taking pressure from the gray space side. I felt the tether go tight the same moment the hunter pressed. 2 seconds, deliberate. The same event from opposite ends. Whatever the hunter was doing to the gray space wall, Eddie was inside it. I tried to push the force into the ground, the way I'd send a cost into the sink, outward and down. The cemetery took some of it, but not enough to change the math, and Mortimer kept loading. The hunter kept driving me back toward the gate from angles I couldn't predict. My right shoulder was hurting in a way I'd have to deal with later. And I was losing ground. I didn't have to lose. I had a bracelet packed with 7 months of costs, snapbacks, the hunter's own force from the street, and the cemetery's density pulling in on top of all of it. Mortimer was at capacity. Nothing more was going in until something came out. I couldn't absorb more, and I couldn't dissipate fast enough. I was against the fieldstone marker with the hunter 3 feet away, and I had nowhere to put what I was holding. Mortimer released. Not my decision, or not entirely. The bracelet had more in it than it could contain, and it let go in the direction the pressure was coming from. The burst moved outward in a wave I felt in the bones of my forearm and in the air pressure around my wrist, traveling toward something I hadn't known I was pointing at. 7 months of accumulated weight left the bracelet at once and went back the way most of it had come from. The hunter backed off 3 feet to 10, then 15. The column of dust 30 feet inside the gate dispersed in a circle that radiated outward and settled. I straightened up against the marker. My right arm was numb from the elbow down. I stood there for a moment looking at the space where the hunter had been. The cemetery was quiet around me, the deep settled quiet of a place that had been absorbing things for over a century. I looked at Mortimer on my wrist. The bracelet had cooled a degree from letting go of what it had been holding. I could still feel the sink pulling in from the ground around me, deep and steady, offering what it had. Something had just happened that I didn't have a name for. The bracelet had taken the hunter's force all season and held it. Tonight it had held too much and let it back out in the direction it came from. I didn't know how it worked. What I knew was that the thing pressing on the gray space wall from outside had just received 7 months of its own force returned at close range, plus everything the cemetery had put into the bracelet in the last few minutes, and it had backed off. That was enough. I drew from the ground deliberately, the same motion as the anchor work but inverted, instead of feeling for structure. I was filling the bracelet. The sink was deep here. It gave willingly. Mortimer warmed toward full again faster than I'd expected. The cemetery had a lot to give. The hunter had moved 12 feet back and was circling for a new angle. I found it in the dark by where the dust was lifting and pointed Mortimer at the column and fired. This one on purpose, cleaner than the first. The hunter stopped circling. Then it did something it hadn't done yet. It stopped moving entirely. The dust column stood in place. The temperature in the air around me steadied. The hunter held its position 12 feet away, not pressing or shifting. And the cemetery's quiet deepened around the held shape of it, the stillness of something that had decided to wait. Whatever was over there was taking the bracelet's burst and thinking about it. I'd been hunted by patient things before. This wasn't that. A sound came through the air near the dust column. Not the radio. The radio was off, and the caller's channel had been quiet since the apartment. Not a voice in any way I had vocabulary for. Closer to the way the gray space frequency had come through that night at the warehouse, two pitches almost forming a syllable, but mechanical edged and sharp. The way the hunter had sounded the one time it had come through the radio at the Ward Cemetery, looking inward at the passenger seat. The word arrived malformed, static, trying to be language and falling short. Kept. The tether went tight in the exact instant the word landed, the bracelet pulling at my wrist toward where Eddie was, Eddie reacting from the other end. The pocket compressing not because the hunter was pressing, but because the thing on the receiving end of the word had felt itself called. I didn't say anything. There wasn't time, and there wasn't a thing to say. The hunter pressed from a new angle, lower and faster. The pause was over. The third exchange went hard. I took part of the hit on the bracelet, fired back, lost 3 feet of ground. The hunter pulled the line on me. I'd been firing toward where the dust column had been, and the column had moved while I was loading. And the angle I fired at was empty space. Mortimer's burst went into a row of stones 20 feet to my left. I corrected and fired again from the new position, but the hunter was already coming from another direction. It was learning me specifically, not just the timing, but where I was pointing and where I'd point next. The fourth exchange cost me my footing. I went down on one knee, came back up, loaded and fired from the lower position. The burst went wide. The hunter pressed from a new angle before I'd fully recovered, and I caught the full weight of it against a flat section of the cemetery's interior stone wall. My vision went to static and came back. The tether went tight again, Eddie on the other end of this. The pocket compressing, and that was enough to get me back on my feet faster than my body wanted to. I loaded again, the sync gave, and Mortimer climbed toward full. The fifth exchange I was ready for. I'd clocked the interval between when the hunter absorbed a burst and when it came back. The temperature in the air had also started dropping a half second before each press now. Consistent enough that I could use it. We were each learning the other's timing. The math was going to come down to who ran out of room first. I had Mortimer at capacity when the air dropped temperature on my left, and I didn't wait for the impact to fire. I aimed and released before the force arrived. The burst and the hunter's press hit each other in the space between us. The result knocked me back 3 steps and I didn't go down. Whatever the hunter took from the collision, it took at close range with nowhere to redirect. It backed off further than it had any previous time, 12 feet, then 20. Then out of the cemetery. The cemetery went quiet. The cost density in the ground settled back toward its resting depth. Mortimer cooled toward warm. Outside the cemetery walls, the hunter was still somewhere in Ashford. Patient things don't stop. They regroup, but it wasn't here. It wasn't pressing. It was out of anything Mortimer could reach. I sat down on the wet February grass in front of the worn markers and waited for my hands to stop shaking. They took a while. When they were done, I stayed there anyway. The cold coming up through my coat from the ground felt clean, and I wasn't in a hurry to stand up. After a while, I stood up. Chapter 4. Eddie was in the passenger seat when I got back to the Taurus. I'd expected that. The way he looked when I opened the door was something I hadn't prepared for. His solidity was wrong. Not the way it had briefly thinned during the Alderton work. That had been a count of two and come back. This was ongoing. The stitching on his jacket collar that had been clean and sharp for months kept thinning out and coming back, on a rhythm I couldn't clock. He was solid, then half there, then solid again. He had his hands in his lap and was looking at them like a man taking inventory. I got in and drove, sitting in a cemetery parking area after that, seeming like a poor plan. The river road was quiet. February at 10:30, the city pulling in its edges. Only the buses and the people who had nowhere to be running the late routes. Eddie watched the buildings go past from his side. He didn't say anything about my face, which I appreciated. And I didn't say anything about the flickering, which he appeared to appreciate back. I took stock as I drove. My right shoulder needed work, probably tomorrow. The left forearm was bruised from the station wagon but functional. My ribs on the right were going to be vivid in the morning. Some blood on my face, nothing structural. Mortimer was cooling, down from furnace hot toward warm. The transaction heat bleeding off the way it did after active work. The bracelet had done something tonight it hadn't been built to do, or maybe it had been built to do it and nobody had bothered to mention that. I'd figure out which one later. Somewhere on the river road, Eddie thinned far enough that I could see the door panel behind him for half a second. The chrome on the window crank, the upholstery seam where his shoulder had been blocking the view. Then he was solid again. Neither of us said anything about it. We both already knew what it was. April called somewhere on the East Loop. I let it go to voicemail and then called back. She had two things. Voss's office had forwarded the confirmation that the credential freeze had landed. Rhodes was in a bureau holding room and the special assessor position was formally terminated. And Caruso had moved on Hartford earlier that evening. One arrest, financial trail, public, case building. The legal track had worked, as far as it had gone, which was as far as anyone had promised. I said, good. She asked if I was okay. There was a pause in the question that meant she already had a guess. I told her I'd call in the morning and hung up. She'd know from the morning call whether to believe that. I drove the river road for another loop, and eventually pulled over on the east stretch where the buildings thin and you can actually see the water. I cut the engine. The river was moving, dark and ordinary. I looked at Eddie. How bad, I said. Not a question. I could see the answer in the flickering. I was asking him to put a number on it. He took a beat, Eddie's deciding how honest pause always short. The pocket took pressure from both sides for close to an hour. Between last night and tonight. He looked at his hands. I'm here, but there's less room than there was this morning. Less room. A gray space that had always held enough stability, enough of whatever it used in place of walls and floor. Tonight there was less of it. And the hunter that had done the pressing was not gone. It had pulled back somewhere in Ashford and would come for the signal again as soon as Mortimer ran loud enough to draw it. Neither of us said it. I looked at the river, and Eddie looked at the river, and neither of us said anything for a while. We'd been doing that in this car for as long as it had been ours. The quiet tonight had a weight to it I recognized. He'd been working on something since before I got back to the Taurus. I'd felt it through the tether when the pocket was compressing, and I was firing and the whole thing was too loud and too fast to process. Outside the car, a couple walked the river path, close together against the cold, not talking. They went past without looking at the Taurus. Chapter 5. Eddie said he had something to tell me. It was probably going to make me angry. I told him I wasn't going to be angry. You might be, he said. I would be. He looked at the river for a moment. 7 years, he said. I came through the gray space at the river because you tore a hole and I was in the wrong place at the right time, or the right place at the wrong time. We've been figuring it out since. He looked at me. And according to Marcus and Leland and your bracelet, none of it was an accident. Someone set this up before the river. Someone had a reason. We'll find out what the reason is, I said. Yeah, we will, but I'm not going to find it from here. He looked at his hands, solid now, the flicker eased while we'd been sitting here. Whatever the pocket's current state was, it was better than it had been when I got back to the car. The callers had the door open over a year, Sam. The gray space was never built to keep someone this long, and the hunter just proved it. I need to find out what's on the other side. Not because I've decided anything. Because I can't decide until I've looked. He looked at the dashboard. The city at 10:30. A bus grinding somewhere in the distance. And the tether running from Moromir's cool metal on my wrist to wherever Eddie was in the gray space, faint and steady, the way it had been running since the foundry. I asked if he was coming back. I don't know yet, he said. That's not the same as no, I said. No, he said. It's not. The radio crackled once, the caller's frequency, low and steady. 3 seconds of it, then nothing, not pulling, not pressing. Just noting that it had heard. I looked at the river, and Eddie looked at the river. I've been dead 7 years, Eddie said. Time to find out what's been on the other side of that door. Okay, I said. He looked at me the way he did when he'd settled something and wasn't going to revisit it. He said I'd be all right, but I told him not to start. He said I would, though, with the easy certainty he brought to anything he was sure of. I didn't answer. He wasn't wrong. I'd stopped arguing with Eddie about that kind of thing a long time ago. He looked at the river once more, east, the way he always looked. The way he'd been looking the night the frequency first came through the radio, and neither of us had a name for what we were hearing. I'd never asked why he faced east, and he'd never told me. He was there, and then he wasn't. The radio came on by itself for half a second, not the caller's frequency exactly, something brighter. The door opening just wide enough to let him through, and then closing again. The cold in the car shifted with him, a column of February air at the passenger seat thinning out, and then settling back to the same temperature as the rest of the cabin. Moromir pulsed once at my wrist, then went quiet. No sound after that, no light, no door I could point to. The gray space pocket was still present. I could feel the tether, faint and running. The same continuous thread from Moromir to the gray space that had been there since the foundry. Not cut, just changed. The other end of it had gone through whatever the caller had opened. I spent a few minutes staring at the empty passenger seat. I started the engine. I pulled out onto the river road and drove north. Moromir cooling at my wrist, down through warm toward ambient, the quietest it had been in months. The tether running from the bracelet to somewhere I couldn't follow. The city coming back up around the north loop, apartment lights in windows, a bus pulling away from a stop, a woman walking a dog and not looking up, Ashford going through its late-night motions the same as any Thursday. The tether was still there. That was the part I kept coming back to. Somewhere down the line he was going to come back and tell me what he found, or he wasn't.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.